Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm Ben Plumley, and we are coming to you, as you know, from AIDS 2024 in Munich, Germany. Now, I've taken this opportunity while my other co hosts, Jeff Sturcio and Yvette Raphael, are walking the halls of the conference to catch up with two people that I've been dying to get on the show for quite a while. A month or so ago, I was on a virtual fireside chat taking place in the hallowed halls of the World Health Assembly, nay, even the United Nations building, I think, in Geneva. And it was organized by the G20 and G7 Health Development Partnership. And it was a fantastic panel with the Deutsche Welt journalist Ali Aslan and the Turkish actor and activist Mert Firat. And it got me thinking, with so much going on in infectious disease, it made real sense for us to get a better handle of what this H20 partnership, H20 Health and Development Partnership is, what it's achieving, and particularly how it's evolved since COVID-19. And so I'm absolutely delighted that we are being joined from London by the convener and founder, Alan Donnelly, and also the partnership's chief executive officer, Hatice Breton. Hatice, Alan, welcome to A Shot in the Arm.
Nice to join you.
Thank you, Ben.
So, Alan, first of all, if I may, you have a long history of political engagement, shall I say, in the United Kingdom. And before we get into the details of transforming health at the multilateral level, I just wanted to ask you a bit about your background, particularly as I think, and of course we are a non-partisan podcast, but you and I probably have same tribal politics from the Neil Kinnock era of the Labour Party. So remind us, you were an MEP while Britain still had MEPs, right?
Yeah, I was elected in '89 and left in 2000. So I had 11 fantastic years in the European Parliament when it was doing everything from creating the single currency to, of course, German unification, which I played a part in. So they were really the best times. And when I look back, the excitement at the beginning of 1990 when the Berlin Wall was disappearing and the prospects for Europe coming together. And now I look at the situation in Ukraine. It really is incredibly sad, and it just shows that you cannot for a minute take democracy for granted.
Which, of course, is what we Brits sort of did during the 2010s. But again, one final sort of comment on that. I'm actually rather pleased that we're only able to do the podcast now that we have the results of the 2024 general election. How are you feeling about that?
I think it's, well, the teacher and I actually were in the British Parliament on Monday evening with Neil Kinnock, who you mentioned. We were hosting an event for the Labour movement in Europe. And interestingly, there were over 100 new Labour MPs who turned up for the event, who are very pro-European. And so when it comes to our relationships with Europe, I think the prospects are much better actually for next year. We've got to renegotiate the settlement, and the signals that we're getting from Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's in the cabinet doing the negotiations, but also from a lot of the ambassadors, there's a much more positive mood music. Now, of course, the devil is in the detail, but we've no longer got this political psychodrama going on in Britain, so we can actually focus on what's best for the people who live here.
Yes, well, we'll be watching this really closely, and of course, how it plays out hopefully for a renaissance in British overseas development partnerships. Hatice, you are the CEO of the partnership. What's your background? How did you get into this?
Yeah, I find it surprising myself how I find myself in the health community. I had a time in the German Foreign Office before I joined Alan's company a few years ago. And in fact, I have started in Brussels in 2016 when the Brexit vote happened in the European Parliament. So speaking about obviously British politics, I've been through the entire transition as well with Alan. But in 2016, we started our conversations with Alan of how we can basically work with the German government to support them in basically leveraging health up onto G20 agendas. But this came at a request of back then our Chancellor Angela Merkel. You can hear from the accent, I'm from Germany. And Alan asked me whether I would help to create this global movement on health and bring different actors together. Following a conversation with officials in the German government, we started this movement, and we thought it will be a one-off initiative during 2017 in Berlin during the G20, because it was the first time Germany has placed health and the health ministers meeting on their agenda. But here we are, a few years later, we're still running strong.
And so funny you make the German reference, Hatice, because Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in the opening plenary of the conference here. I think all of us have been really surprised and really welcome the leadership that Germany is continuing to show in global health and global HIV particularly. And, I think there are a lot of expectations, notwithstanding what's unfortunately happening in Ukraine and what that means for European investment there. But a lot of hope that Germany will, I suppose, assume a lead that Britain may or may not have had in the past, but which I think it assumed it had in sort of leading a European development approach that is, really rooted in the needs of the communities right on the front line. But I guess that gets us to the Health and Development Partnership itself. You launched it, as you said, in Berlin just prior to COVID. First up, what were its goals? What were you hoping to get from it before the pandemic hit?
For Alan or me?
Whichever you would like.
Okay.
Well, from my point of view, I'm not a health expert. I spent my time in politics dealing with economic and monetary policy and industrial policy. But what was very clear was that the health community is very fragmented, as you know. So, for example, you've got the HIV/AIDS conference today, which is very important, of course. But what tends to happen is the health community operates in disease silos, and there's not much horizontal. There wasn't much horizontal dialogue between these different groups. And the other thing, of course, is the health is very much an economic lever in our economies nationally and globally. And so our aim at the very beginning was, how can we bring together the different silos and get them to work together on a common agenda? And then secondly, how could we ensure that health and economics were understood by politicians? Because most politicians are not health experts, but because they're elected, they do know that if their economies aren't performing well, they will suffer consequences. And so we've been trying to demonstrate that investing in health produces really valuable socioeconomic outcomes. And so they were the original common goals.
Yeah, I guess from my part then, to just add to that, what I wanted to get out of it is, equally to Alan, I didn't have a health background, and I studied political science and political economy. And when I started this initiative, it got us thinking, all of these institutions, be it public-private partnerships, pharma, NGOs, academia, they're calling out for more money for global health. And everyone kept saying since 2017, the classic ODA funding is not working. Our budgets are stretched. Governments cannot close the SDGs 3 funding gap until 2030. But yet no one really looked for different solutions other than just ODA funding. It fell to us back at the time. So my main inspiration was, so how can we look into how we can change the narrative of asking for money with finance ministers and making the case that this is not only because of health or improving health, it's also improving economies, societies, education, productivity growth. And that's how I think we got into this. And partners, of course, and our members and partners were quite excited to continue on that path.
And we actually, Ben, we had an early success because we persuaded the Japanese Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister Abe, during the 2019 presidency, Japanese presidency of the G20, to hold the first joint health and finance ministers meeting. And that was the first time ever finance ministers and health ministers had been in the same room at the same time. And that now continues. It's an important legacy from Prime Minister Abe. And it's critical because it means increasingly now the language that comes out of declarations, whether it's to do with low and middle income countries or whether it's a global pandemic, ministers now all talk about investing in health rather than just seeing health as an expenditure.
Right. And so this is all music to my ears. It's what I guess I've been working on since the early 2000s. Really conscious that it's great to have ministers of health at the WHO or at the UNAIDS coordinating board. But let's be honest, in most countries, about where ministers of health sit on the pecking order. And if you don't have the finance chiefs, the people in charge of the purse strings at the table driving the agenda, a lot of our advocacy goes to waste. And the other thing that it strikes me, I too do not have a medical background. Mine, unfortunately, is as an undergraduate in theology, but then medical ethics. So thank God. But I think it's really useful that people who are not coming directly from, let's say, the lab or from the very technical side of things are able to show and join the dots between health, economics, you mentioned education, social development. And that's really, I think, where we all got ourselves under the microscope in COVID. And so I just wonder how the agenda has changed for you since COVID. We've got the German Global Health Hub. We have delays in negotiating the pandemics treaty. And, are we at risk of repeating the failure of the 1918 flu, where all societies seem to develop a sort of collective amnesia to what had happened? How are you keeping those lessons at the forefront of this sort of multidisciplinary set of key stakeholders?
Well, this year is potentially a year where we can create something quite new, because there will be the UN high-level meeting in September on antimicrobial resistance, which I know is a big issue for people who have multi-infections, who have HIV or AIDS and would have tuberculosis and other infections. And so drug resistance becomes a really critical, it's a matter of life or death, actually, for many people, particularly in LMICs. And then in November, the Saudi government were charged by the WHO to host the fourth antimicrobial resistance ministerial meeting. And so what we're trying to do within our partnership and with our partners is to say, look, this is an opportunity to create a better architecture for how we deal with some of these existential threats. For example, something that Hatice has done a lot of work on is bringing together multilateral development banks and for them to have a common language and a common roadmap to deal, for example, with AMR, but it could be for dealing with non-communicable diseases too. So the thing is that this year gives us an opportunity, if we're successful, to work with a whole series of new partners to try and create something that will be applicable to AMR, but can be applicable to other challenges that we face in the future.
Just maybe if I may add then to that, reflecting on pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, I think that's what you're referring to as well. I think what we tried to do is, while we were trying to, drum the bells here to say, okay, health is wealth, health is a financing matter, we need to have a structured dialogue like we just discussed a few minutes ago. It was the pandemic, strangely, and it's ironically for me to say that, was music to our ears that after or during the pandemic, finally, finance ministers, spoke about a new debt restructuring form for governments who couldn't finance, obviously, and close the budget gaps in the pandemic. So finance ministers were an integral part of the conversation. But also, if you remember the ACT Accelerator initiative, we gathered together with the G20, the European Union, other world leaders to create ACT Day. There was a joint approach between all sectors to raise funds for therapeutics, diagnostics, and obviously vaccines. And I've never seen such a unity amongst players, and everyone put their politics aside in the health community. There's a lot of silos. We discussed it many times. And that was remarkable. And this gave us the hope that we can continue that dialogue. And of course, as a result, under Indonesia, leading to Italy, the Joint Health and Finance Task Force was created. They're discussing new models of financing for health. Also, vulnerability studies is what they're conducting. However, coming to your point on now the creation of a pre-pandemic global AMR R&D hub, or the pandemic intelligence hub that you're referring to, that's actually sits in Berlin, and all the other hubs, or the pandemic treaty. What it feels like for non-health experts and finance ministers and other players we're talking to is, so now we have all these hubs and treaties, it's all good, but how do they match together? Like, how can we make a all systems approach? And okay, we can put money in different pots, but what's the overall goal here? And everyone has their different lobby agendas, of course, but I think if we want to your point, if we want to reduce the risk of further politicization of these health funding streams, we need to also work, I say the global health community, we need to work together to understand how can we make a joint approach to show the integral or the differences of these funds and how they match together to contribute to the entire ecosystem, which ultimately obviously improves the SDGs. But I think we have learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic. There were a lot of best practices, but I think we're scaling down a little bit, going to the old habits. And that's what we are trying to basically change or, bring to people's awareness.
And Ben, the event that you attended in June at the World Health Organization headquarters, which, as you know, there was Tedros spoke, the Vice President of the European Investment Bank, we had ministers and so forth. But the reason why it gets so much traction is it's probably the only body that brings together the not-for-profit organizations, the product development partnerships that develop new tools, for example, Medicines for Malaria Ventures, one or a leading member. It brings together leading academic institutions, but it also brings together the small biotech community and some representation from the large innovative pharmaceutical companies. And I have to say, Hatice and the team in the partnership have done a remarkable job, because we get a common call to action after that H20. We're just literally finalizing today the call to action that will go to the G20 leaders meeting and health ministers meeting, and that will go to the G7 health ministers meeting in October. And incredibly, all of those different actors and players normally coalesce around a series of very, very concrete recommendations. And I think that's why we've been able to get traction with governments. So we're already in dialogue with South Africa, who will have the G20 next year, and Canada, who will have the G7. And they want to talk to us because they see that in one single meeting, they can reach out literally to the whole of the health community. And our partners are themselves a series of partnerships. So the partnership probably represents globally around 10,000 organizations around the world. And I think this is why it's had so much success. And it's not for profit. That's the other thing. It's a not for profit organization.
I mean, one of the things I was pretty blown away with by the meeting in June was precisely that you were able to get WHO and the private sector, particularly medicines and vaccines and diagnostics manufacturers, together. In the HIV field, we found that a really big challenge, and particularly around, of course, this very rapid evolution of treatment and prevention. It's been a real challenge for the WHO, established as it was in the post-war period as a as part of that whole multilateral movement, but it's been very hard for them to find ways of engaging with the private sector precisely in the way that you did. There was one thing I wanted to pick up on, Hatice, on your analysis of the COVID experience, and you are, from a global health perspective, one of the few people I've heard praising the ACT accelerator. So that was nice to hear, and I know my colleagues would be thrilled about it. But I think one of the anxieties that we all felt was that we had this reversal to vaccine nationalism, that I'm all right, Jack, and then it's what's left for you. And I think there's a palpable sense of we cannot make that mistake again. And you see the impact of particularly African countries realizing that they were on their own. You see that apply in other geopolitical issues. So, for example, the call of the US and the UK and others to try and build a sort of a solid momentum against Russia after its invasion of Ukraine, and seeing particularly the neutrality, nay, potentially even some of the support for Russia coming from African countries. Talking to the politicians we do, that clearly had some roots in their experience of COVID. So I think it's really interesting and really important that you are leading these kind of multi-sectoral conversations and getting to the people who hold the purse strings. So besides the call to action coming out of the meeting in 2024, what else was there that was of note, besides obviously the absolutely terrific fireside chat that I was involved in?
I think, to your point, can I just make a quick reference going back to the WHO? I think we have to note, obviously, the WHO has faced its challenges and is facing its challenges with having 197 member states that they need to navigate as a technical body. But to be honest, Ben, I think it also speaks to the leadership of Dr. Tedros to allow us actually the space to criticize the WHO within the WHO with different actors. And he's open to that, and that gives him the opportunity, and all, obviously, his colleagues, to talk to different industries in one room. But previously, I hadn't seen an attempt either of that we were enabled by such a leader to openly criticize and help shape proactively with different industries the policies. And this is why the call to action is basically a combination of looking at the broader health systems issues and obviously where we want to be with our ecosystems, our planetary health by 2030. But it is not only praising the WHO because we did it at the WHO. So that's important to note, I think. But to your question on what else came out of the H20, I think we had a few key takeaways. One of them was that everyone agrees, again, we need to change the ways of how we finance health. We need to also change basically with the help of the Brazilian G20 presidency, they triggered the discussion how we maybe change loan conditionalities, extend loans for countries with the condition to invest in health. Attempts have been done previously. But one of the main things that came out of it is also, and I let Alan talk about the AMR Legislators Initiative, that was the key moment. But from the financing point of view, we discussed in length how we can bridge the debt valley between investors and the health community or countries that, or health ministers that want investment into health. And a clear takeaway was, yes, the global health community or health ministries do not know how to talk to investors strategically to see health as an investment. Do we need a taxonomy like we do in climate change? And the European Union has been a leader in the health, in the climate change taxonomy? Or do we attach health as a component into the climate change taxonomy in order to speak the same language, use the same tools with investors and change the way of funding for health? Obviously not, it can't change the whole funding gap, but it can open a new avenue. And one of the takeaways was we need to work on this taxonomy in order to take a step before we develop new models of funding for health. So that was on the financing part. But on the AMR part, I think we launched something groundbreaking, which I hand over to Alan.
Yeah, I mean, just one of the things on the financing, and we're in discussions at the moment. We've had discussions with the EIB, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and we'll be speaking to others. Is that, you know, and there are some very good examples of this, where a country chooses to invest from its own resources in health, say, or it could be in education, and it's certainly the case in climate change, because this operates now in climate change. Then the multilateral development banks and the IMF and so forth are looking at mechanisms that can ease the debt burden, because many of these countries are in massive sovereign debt. And so one of the things we've been saying is, rather than just relying on philanthropy, if a country says, look, we're going to commit 1% of our GDP to invest in health, can you help us with our debt burden? Then it just seems logical that these multilateral development banks should move away from the Bretton Woods model that's completely out of date now, and do something that's much more creative. So we're working actively on that, and anyone who's watching this, if you're interested in that and you want to help with that, then, you know, via Ben, let us know. The Legislators Initiative is something that we've been talking about for a couple of years now, because when I was a member of Parliament, a member of the European Parliament, you would get the European Commission President or a commissioner going to a G20 meeting or a G7 meeting, or the IMF spring or autumn meetings. And then they'd come back, they'd give a short report in the chamber, and then we'd move on to the next item of business. And that sometimes happens in national parliaments, but it doesn't always. There's not always a report back to national parliaments by the head of state or by the health minister or the finance minister. So what we decided to do was to create a legislators initiative, and we approached the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, which represents 56 national parliaments, but a lot of regional parliaments too. And we approached the Francophonie Parliamentary Association, which represents over 100 parliaments around the world. And we said to them, look, would you work together on producing a short report, practical report, which we can give to legislators as a tool so that they can start asking questions in their parliament of ministers. Now, the reason we need that is because the vast majority of legislators are not health experts, as we said earlier. So we've created a structure and a toolbox for them to be able to say, oh, there was a G20, for example, there's a G20 finance ministers meeting coming up now. It'd be quite interesting to get parliamentarians to ask questions of their finance ministers. What discussion was there on investing in health? And, you know, the thing is, through doing this, and you know this through your own advocacy in the the HIV/AIDS space, that by constantly pressing ministers, eventually you get their attention. So we worked for 6 months with Agnès Buzyn, the former French health minister, Dame Angela Eagle, who's a member of the British Parliament, who now actually is the new Minister for Immigration in the Home Office.
That's right. Yeah.
And also Christopher Kalila from the Zambian Parliament, who chairs the Health Committee there. And they put this report together. It's been endorsed by Dr. Tedros. And we're literally in the process at the moment of seeing how we can get this out to, all the parliaments around the world. We've got it in French and Spanish and English, to try and get it out to parliaments, to get legislators, not just one-off attempts to ask a question, but to constantly ask, what are you doing on this after you've been to these international meetings?
This is so refreshing to hear, because I think we in the global health field have, in our own sort of slightly self-referential way, tried to do the same and had really negligible results. And I think it is really incumbent upon us to be much more directly allied with what you're doing, not get in the way, but really piggyback on what you're doing.
Well,
I think of the range. Sorry, Galen, go ahead. Sorry.
No, this initiative is specifically on antimicrobial resistance, because it's the big topic of 2024. But next year we'll do it on non-communicable diseases. But we can, if we can build this global health legislators network, we can do it in so many other areas. And we've got this big tent called G20, G7 partnership. Everyone's welcome to participate in it.
Ben, you said, I know
you go ahead, Hatice, and then I'll dive in.
Okay, you said to us, you are asking the questions, but you said challenge me as well. So I was wondering, these AIDS conferences are happening every year. I've never attended one, as a disclaimer, but I was wondering, have you seen any changes in these conferences, or have you seen a cross-sectorial community being there, or MPs being more held to account? Because there are actually so many good initiatives in the HIV space. It's like it's the best practice that's being used all over the world for many years, right? So
well, these conferences happen every 2 years, thank heavens, because I don't know that we could cope with 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. sessions non-stop, and then like good AIDS activists that we are, go out and party afterwards. But it really has evolved, and there have been a range of parliamentary networks and forums on HIV. The UK, through its all-party parliamentary group, was a great leader of that, still is, in fact. I think what we have seen since about 2016 is perhaps a waning of enthusiasm, a fatigue, and a sense that we are increasingly talking to ourselves. But I mean, I'm also an American citizen, and my local congresswoman Barbara Lee is going to be here tonight and tomorrow. There have been a range of leading parliamentarians here. And I think the big thing that we are really picking up on now is that the age of HIV, AIDS exceptionalism is over, and that we have to view HIV as perhaps one of the first 21st century zoonotic pandemics like COVID. And that we need to be working together collectively. Certainly, a lot of the investments in HIV over the last few decades were immensely helpful to the COVID response. The vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, particularly the research into mRNA, was done under the auspices of HIV vaccine research. No success there, but it helped set the framework. And then things like community health workers that have been really central to the HIV response, and who in many countries, like Bangladesh particularly comes to mind, were at the forefront of that that country's COVID response. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of them in the course of the pandemic because they were on the front line. But there are definitely lessons learned, and I'm worried that we are going back into our silo. I'm worried that we are beginning to, play the numbers game, as in, well, we've got more infections than you, so we should get the lion's share of the money. But in fact, one of the other big stories of this week has been in relation to AMR, and it has been around the use of doxycycline for pre-exposure prophylaxis, largely in men who have sex with men, as a way of preventing syphilis and gonorrhea. And, WHO is reporting massive increases in rates of infection of STIs. And the issue will be, and it's been a really controversial discussion point this week, is making this hugely valuable antibiotic available at scale. Is that really wise? And it opens all sorts of wounds, from personal autonomy to a broader public health agenda, and I see very clearly a very strong linkage with AMR. And as you were talking earlier, the other part of the equation with AMR, which sort of brings you back to One Health and zoonotic infections, is of course the use of antibiotics in the agricultural industry, and I know that has been a huge issue from a public health perspective, where we've not really had any impact at all. And it wouldn't surprise me if the approach that you're taking is likely to generate much greater fruits much more rapidly.
Yeah, just maybe on the One Health approach, how they call it, and the use of antimicrobials in the agricultural chain is a big issue. And also for this year, all the conversations we had in various high-level fora, from WHA to a big event in London, and also in the G7 and the G20s, I think there's a wide recognition then that if we speak about AMR, we don't just speak about human health. And the matter of the problem is, you will know this, many countries are implementing these national action plans to reduce AMR in their entire ecosystem. But the problem still prevails that people don't know the scale of the problem in the agricultural chain. How much resistances do we have in the poultry farming and etc., right? So how can we tackle that, and how can we have a better structural dialogue? And this is one of the things that we're expecting to feature at the UN high-level meeting on AMR, which is on 26th of September. But then following thereof, at the fourth ministerial conference on AMR in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, we're hoping to basically discuss how we can gather better evidence, how we can measure the benchmarks to look at the tipping point of the problem, so we can basically measure against or develop policies to tackle the problems in the different in the human health, animal health, and agricultural sector. So I think there is a lot of understanding, especially now with the movement of health and climate change, integrating the two. This is music to our ears this year. So how can we keep the momentum and show the linkages? And maybe we love the terminology One Health, and it's established worldwide. But again, that's another, from a public policy point of view, many non-health experts don't really know what it means. So how can we develop a better narrative for politicians and legislators on that as well?
And Ben, one of the things that you said earlier, and I do think this is going to be critical when it comes to developing new tools for AMR, but also for new tools for particularly other infectious diseases. I do think that regions of the world that were treated very, very badly because of vaccine nationalism over COVID, it is quite right that they are now wanting to develop their own capacity. And so one of the things we're also doing in our partnership and in our discussions with some of the G20 countries is to look at how we can encourage them to develop logistics hubs and supply chains. And even in some parts of the world, we had discussions not so long ago with the African CDC. We've got to realize that as countries look at health in a different way, they're going to want to have their own capacity and their own ability to respond. And I'll give you one example. Baroness Scotland, Patricia Scotland, who's the outgoing head of the Commonwealth, who's a fantastic person. She was very concerned about the Caribbean islands at the beginning of 2020 because they didn't have any COVID. But she said, look, we need the vaccine, or certainly when the vaccine became available, we need it, because if we vaccinate them now, then we can save their economies. And we lobbied heavily with COVAX, and sadly, because of the political pressure, those smaller countries were told they just had to get in the queue. And this is not acceptable, because it then turned out that some of those islands had their economies decimated because of COVID. So we can't go on doing things as we've done them in the past. And that applies particularly to the potential of a new pandemic, but also some of the epidemics that we see, and some of the communicable diseases that should be tackled in a different way.
Maybe just
sorry, I was just going to add, Hatice, and as you look at non-communicable diseases next year, mental health is obviously going to be key, given the way in which it spiraled after COVID. But Hatice, sorry, over to you.
No, just a point. I think we discussed it also with you at the H20. One of the biggest concerns we have, you mentioned IMB before. While we welcome that finally there will be an agreement, accord, however they end up calling it, down the line on pandemics, we are also concerned that because the negotiations were so politicized and it went back and forth, a lot of iterations and notions, that this will impact future treaties, agreements, or declarations, such as the UN declaration coming up. Have we basically created a bit of a fear, and people are like, oh no, we just keep business as normal and we don't want to be too ambitious. So the psychology of that as well is our concern, and we're hearing this from some actors. And how can we?
Absolutely. We're hearing it too, and the idea that, if you need to agree a treaty, do not give it to the WHO to organize, which may be a little bit fair, but may be largely unfair too. I realize we're getting to the top of the hour, and I realize that we have, barely skimmed the surface. What really strikes me is, and I got this sense from participating in, admittedly in such a limited way, in the 2024 meeting, is that there is a lot we in the global health community can and must be learning from you. And I think there are perspectives you have on new investment models, on tackling pandemic preparedness, on tackling trust in institutions, that I think we really have to put away our white coats and just listen and learn. So I wonder, I hope we can come back perhaps and explore some of these innovations that you're exploring in more detail, not least how we deal with the impact of these debts that countries have run up over the years. We're actually going to be at the UN General Assembly in September. We, for our sins, are part of this Summit for the Future, and the organization that we sit under, the Global Listening Project, will be doing a number of events there, looking at how we can rebuild trust, particularly looking at the 18 to 24-year-olds. So I hope, if you're okay with it, that this is the start of a conversation. And I can't tell you how hugely informative and helpful this has been.
Thank you. I mean, from our side, we love the challenging conversations and also being able to just speak out our minds and our experiences. So we see it as a start of a long-term, hopefully, partnership as well. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Ben. And Ben, you've got to tell me, which is the district for Barbara Lee?
District 13, it is it District 7 now? But it's Oakland, California. She was
Right.
not successful in being the Democrat candidate for Senate this year. So she actually steps down. It's a bit of an end of an era for us.
Yeah. No, honestly, these parliamentarians and legislators who take the time to support these very important initiatives, they're worth their weight in gold, I'll tell you.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, Alan, as a final comment, I bow to you that you had dinner with my number one political hero, Neil Kinnock. So terrific.
No.
He is a legend.
Nice to talk to you anyway. And
Likewise.
very happy to go further. And if anyone listening here sees this, wants to have a look, you know, our the G20, G7 Health and Development Partnership website is there, and feel free to communicate with us. We'd like to hear from you.
Absolutely. And we will promote the link in the show notes, and we'll promote it widely through our digital and social media outreach. So, yeah, well, thank you very much and have a great rest of the day.
Enjoy Munich. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you very much to Alan and to Hatice. My gosh, what a refreshing conversation. And, you know, to be able to see that there are things that we can do in partnership. Thanks also to Erica Spera, our director and producer from NewsDoc Media. We are a project of the Global Listening Project, and it just remains for me to wish you a great day and a safe day, everybody.